The wind tore through the jagged cliffs, a living thing, gnawing at the stone and shrieking like a chorus of the dead. Salt spray stung the eyes, mingling with the sweat and blood that clung to his skin, slick beneath the battered plate of armor. Each gust felt like the breath of the ocean itself, punishing and unforgiving, yet it carried him forward, clawing at the rock, urging him to endure. He crouched low, fingers white around the hilt of his sword, the metal nicked and bent from blows that should have ended him. The weapon whispered to him in the language of loss, the quiet rattle of steel against steel, each scratch a testament to fallen comrades whose laughter and courage were now only memory. Gulls wheel overhead, wings slashing the storm-dark sky, their cries fragmented and hollow. They are ghosts of what once was, a reminder that life carries on in the faces of the living even as the dead hover at the edge of vision. His tongue tastes iron and salt, a bitter cocktail of survival that clings to the back of his throat. He tastes the fire that consumed his village, the black smoke curling into the heavens like a mocking finger. He tastes it, and with it, the memory of bread dense with grain, the honeyed sweetness of mead that had flowed freely in hallways now emptied of voices, now charred and silent. The joy of feasts, the warmth of comradeship, the fragile laughter, all vanished as if swept away by the tide. He now faces alone. Each footfall is a negotiation with the cliff's edge, the jagged rocks slicing at his boots, testing his resolve. He moves like a man caught between two worlds, the world of the living, chaotic and brutal, and the shadowed lands of the fallen. In the silence between waves, he hears their faces, flickering, transient, pressing against his consciousness, urging him to remember and to mourn. Mothers hiding children in cellars, whispering prayers to saints long forgotten. The empty cries of men who once carried spears into the teeth of fire. The moans of the wounded swallowed by the night. All converge, an unholy chorus of grief that hums beneath the roar of the storm. Lightning fractures the sky, illuminating the twisted ruins behind him. Roofs gutted, timbers blackened, streets awash with ash and mud. The remnants of a kingdom erased in a single night. And yet, in the destruction, there is defiance, subtle and stubborn. A tattered banner clings to the cliffside, its colors muted by smoke and salt, fluttering in rhythm with the heartbeats of those still living. He is its last witness, the lone bearer of a story written in fire and steel, a story that no enemy can silence. Every heartbeat thrums with both victory and grief. Survival is not triumph alone, but a covenant with memory and loss. The waves crash endlessly below, each one a hammer upon the rock, each one echoing the violence of the night that nearly claimed him. He can still feel the heat of the fires, the smell of charred wood and flesh, the frantic screams that tore the air like jagged glass. The enemy had come with fire and sword, leaving devastation in their wake. Yet here he stands, bloodied, exhausted, yet unbroken. Every scar etched into his flesh is a sentence in the epic of endurance. Every tremor in his limbs a reminder that life and death are threads woven too tightly to unravel without consequence. As dawn teases the horizon, light creeping like cautious fingers over the foam-capped waves, he allows himself a brief exhale. The storm will pass. The sea will relent. Below, the valley of the living stretches quiet but waiting. Mothers will emerge from their cellars, children blinking against the light, and the survivors will find one another in the ash, in the mud, in the ruins of their homes. And he, alone, carries not just the memory of fire, but the unyielding resilience that it cannot consume. His heart beats a solitary drum in the chest of a land scarred and raw, a rhythm that says, "We endure, and in that endurance lies our defiance." He shifts his weight, feeling the chill of dawn against the backs of his knees, the wind curling through the gaps in his armor like the sigh of lost spirits. Each step downward is tentative, deliberate, a negotiation with gravity and memory alike. He knows that the world he descends into will be changed, and that change will demand of him more than swordplay or courage. It will demand the quiet strength of those who have seen the worst and chosen, despite it all, to move forward. The salt, the smoke, the fire, the screams, they're stitched into his consciousness like runes on an ancient tablet, a story written in endurance and pain. The cliff beneath him is slick, yet he moves with a predator's certainty, aware that the margin for error is as thin as the edge of a blade. His hands, raw and trembling, remember the weight of the dead in their grip, the feel of flesh and chain, the metallic tang of life spilling into the earth. Memories clash and collide like the waves below, his comrades falling in unison with the tide, the enemy's fire relentless, and yet, through it all, a single thread of survival pulls him forward. He is the living echo of a night that none should have survived, a shadow walking through the remnants of history, carrying with him the stories that fire tried and failed to erase. By the time the sun fully rises, gilding the ocean with pale light, he reaches the valley's mouth. The storm has spent itself, leaving a landscape washed in salt, soot, and tentative peace. Gulls settle on the water, wings folded, cries soften to quiet murmurings. The ruined villages, the blackened fields, and the silent corpses are testimony to a world remade in a night of fire. Yet he steps forward with a rhythm that says life persists. Every breath draws in the memory of those lost. Every pulse hums with the resolve of those still living. And in that balance, between grief and perseverance, between ruin and survival, he finds his place. The last legend of a vanished kingdom, carrying its story in his scars, his sweat, and the steel of his hand. The tattered banner, caught again by a sudden gust, flaps as if in acknowledgment, a fragile signal to a world reborn in fire and salt. The wind, once howling and merciless, now whispers, carrying with it a fragile promise, that even when kingdoms fall and empires vanish, the spirit endures, embodied in the hearts of those who remain. He descends into the valley, the horizon open before him, a path lined with ash and sunlight, memory and hope intertwined. And as he walks, each step becomes a testament to survival, a quiet hymn that the storm cannot drown, a legend written in the marrow of the living, waiting for the stories yet to come. Smoke curled from the thatched roofs, faint against the first light of morning, a ribbon of gray dissolving into the chill of dawn. The village lay in a haunted silence, the scent of charred timber and blood clinging to the air like a stubborn ghost. A young woman moved through the remnants of homes, her feet sinking in a mud thick with ash, her hands trembling as she knelt at the frozen stream, dipping a wooden cup into the icy water. Each sip sent a shiver through her body, but her mind was consumed by echoes that would not fade. The clash of steel, the roar of dying horses, the desperate cries of neighbors swallowed by shadows that had no mercy. Her tunic, once a bright weave of homespun wool, was streaked with soot and dried blood. Over it, a cloak smelling faintly of pine and herbs wrapped her shoulders in a brittle warmth. In the whispered talk of villagers who had returned from the edges of the forest, she was called a ghost, a survivor of a night that had claimed almost all. Their eyes, wide with awe and suspicion alike, followed her as if measuring the weight of her soul against the emptiness around them. And she, moving cautiously over broken boards and scattered belongings, allowed herself to feel both the fragility and stubbornness of her own survival. Every step was careful, a ritual of caution honed by fear, yet her gaze lifted constantly to the horizon, as if challenging the world itself to break her again. She passed the remnants of the hall, where the long oak table lay split and overturned, its goblets rolled into the dust and fragments of candle wax clinging to the carved edges. Smoke from a lingering ember curled lazily toward the low ceiling, a quiet, insistent remnant of life, and she pressed her hand against the wood, letting the warmth of memory seep through her fingers. Here, she had sat with her people, shared bread, laughter, the small comforts of existence. Now, only silence answered her touch, a hollow companion to grief that had become a familiar cloak. In the cold shadow of the walls, she whispered a prayer, not to a distant god, but to the spirits of those whose lives had been stolen. She prayed that they knew she remembered, that their names would not vanish in the smoke, that their blood would not be carried away entirely by the wind. Her voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the raw intensity of loss that demanded acknowledgement. Around her, the village itself seemed to hold its breath, listening. A crow cawed from somewhere beyond the shattered gate, the sound sharp and metallic against the stillness, and she imagined it as a messenger, a witness to what remained. The forest beyond lay shrouded in mist, the trees like dark sentinels guarding the fragile boundary between devastation and life. She stepped carefully through the undergrowth, where frost clung to every branch and leaf, each step releasing the faint crunch of ice. The river ran silver in the dawn, reflecting the faint, stubborn persistence of light. It reminded her that time flowed on, indifferent yet necessary, and that the world, in its slow, deliberate rhythm, demanded that she move forward, even as grief clawed at her heart. Her eyes found a ruined gate again, where a single raven had perched, black feathers shimmering like wet obsidian. It turned its head toward her, bright eyes gleaming, and she felt a shiver of recognition, as if it could see the weight of her choices, the survival etched into the lines of her face. The presence of this bird, small yet insistent, reminded her that life continued, that even in the deepest shadow there were witnesses to her stubborn defiance. Survival was not merely flesh and bone, she realized, but the persistence of spirit, a refusal to vanish entirely into the currents of oblivion. As she moved among the ruins, her fingers brushing against splintered beams and the charred edges of doors, memories surfaced like embers. She remembered the laughter of children who had once played at the edge of the stream, their voices light against the heavy air of the hall. She remembered her mother's hands, calloused and warm, holding hers in the kitchen where sunlight fell like gold across the rough floorboards. She remembered the elder who had taught her to read the patterns in the stars, to know the seasons by the angle of light and the song of birds. These memories were small talismans, fragile as frost, yet they gave her strength to breathe, to continue, to claim existence even when all else had been stripped away. The village's silence was absolute, save for the occasional drip of melting ice from eaves and the distant murmur of the river. In that silence, she felt the presence of those lost as sharply as a wound, the absence of voices and footsteps pressing against her chest. She did not cry. The tears had come and gone long before, leaving only a hollow ache that throbbed in rhythm with the heartbeat of the earth beneath her. She folded her hands over her chest, feeling the steady beat of her own pulse, a stubborn declaration that she remained. From the high hill above the village, she paused to survey what remained. Chimneys jutting like broken teeth, fields scorched and scarred, the bones of fences lying half buried in ash. And yet, even among devastation, there were signs of life. The faintest green along the edges of furrows, the silver flash of fish beneath the river's surface, the small flutter of a bird rising from the woods. These were whispers of possibility, reminders that the world, indifferent as it might be, still offered chances for renewal. She inhaled deeply, letting the cold air fill her lungs, tasting both sorrow and the sharp tang of hope. A soft wind stirred through the village, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and wet earth, mingling with the memory of smoke. It tousled her hair and tugged at the edges of her cloak, and she imagined the wind as a companion, carrying her resolve forward, urging her to journey beyond the ruins and into the uncertain landscape that awaited. She knew that the road ahead would be treacherous, that dangers unseen still lurked beyond the horizon. But for the first time since the night of fire and steel, she felt the quiet stirrings of purpose. She knelt once more at the edge of the river, letting her fingers skim the surface, feeling the chill seep through her skin, grounding her in the present. The river's reflection shimmered like liquid silver, fractured by the faint ripple of her touch, and she saw herself mirrored there, not just the girl who had survived, but a spirit shaped by fire, loss, and relentless endurance. The raven, perched on the ruined gate, watched her for a long moment, and then, with a wing beat that stirred the cold air, it lifted and disappeared into the horizon. She allowed herself a silent acknowledgement, a promise to continue, to honor what had been lost and what remained. As dawn spread fully across the sky, the first rays lighting the remnants of the village with fragile gold, she rose. Each step forward was measured, deliberate, a rhythm of survival. Behind her lay the ashes of what had been, the echo of screams and the shadow of despair. Ahead, the uncertain stretch of road and forest, carrying both peril and the faintest glimmer of possibility. She drew her cloak tighter, lifted her chin, and moved toward the horizon, her shadow long and thin across the frost-stained earth. The village held its breath as she departed, a silent witness to a spirit that refused to vanish, even in the wake of obliteration. And in that quiet, fragile morning, she understood survival was not merely the act of living, but the defiance of memory against forgetting, the courage to walk forward when the world had offered only ruin, and the quiet, unshakable insistence that the human heart, though battered, could endure. The fortress walls shivered beneath the assault of winter wind, as though the stone itself feared the season's cruelty. Snow tumbled from the battlements in silent cascades, each flake glinting like powdered glass before vanishing into the frozen courtyard. Inside, a solitary figure knelt by the hearth, the flickering fire casting long, jagged shadows across the cold stones. His hands were wrapped in blood-stained cloth, pressing against a wound that refused to close. The firelight danced across his face, revealing lines carved deep by hunger, grief, and relentless struggle. He could still feel the echo of axes biting into flesh, the sickening thud of bodies collapsing into the snow, and the acrid smoke of torched timber that had once been home. Outside, the sentries trudged through drifts taller than their knees, their boots sinking into the frozen earth. Their breath rose in ghostly columns, melting almost instantly into the bitter air. The fortress exhaled around them, a hollow, wind-worn sigh through arrow slits and crenellations. Smoke from last night's fires lingered stubbornly, curling over the battlements like a spirit unwilling to leave. Each gust of wind carried with it the scent of frost, wood smoke, and something more elusive, fear hardened into quiet vigilance. He traced a finger over the hilt of his sword, the metal cold and unyielding against his gloved hand. In that touch, he felt the weight of promises, the unspoken oaths sworn to fallen comrades, to a house whose banner now hung tattered and sodden with frost. The lion embroidered on the cloth was scarcely discernible beneath the soot and ice, its roar swallowed by winter's indifferent hand. He licked the salt from his lips, tasting survival and sorrow in equal measure. Every heartbeat was a reminder that the night had taken much, yet left him here, a living testament to endurance. Memories of the siege pressed upon him like a phantom army. He saw it again. The night the sky had seemed to weep arrows, the way shadows had danced across the snow in unnatural choreography, marking the places where men had fallen and never risen again. Silence had reigned then, pierced only by the occasional groan or the brittle snap of a branch underfoot. Comrades had disappeared into the whiteness, their lives absorbed silently by the earth. And still, the snow had continued to fall, indifferent, as though it alone could honor or erase the dead. He rose from the hearth slowly, each movement deliberate, each breath drawn against the icy air that seeped through the cracks in the stone. The fortress felt alive with absence, the hollows of hallways and empty chambers echoing the ghosts of laughter, of clashing swords, of whispered prayers that had gone unanswered. Even the wind seemed to mourn, scraping against walls and towers in long, keening moans. His eyes wandered over the courtyard, over the drifts that glittered like a sea of broken glass. The frozen ground held the memory of conflict, footprints pressed into ice, shapes of shields and discarded helmets frozen in place. A battlefield paused mid-motion. The sentries, wrapped in furs and resolve, passed like shadows, their movements precise and deliberate. He imagined them carrying messages, patrolling for signs of life or danger, yet each step was heavy with the knowledge of fragility. Survival was no triumph here. It was a fragile balance, a slow dance with death that demanded constant attention. The warrior's gaze lifted toward the horizon, where the sky bled into gray and white, clouds hanging like a shroud over distant forests. Somewhere beyond those hills, the world persisted. Villages lit by fires, fields sleeping beneath snow, the distant clatter of daily life continuing as though the siege had never been. But here, in this isolated bastion of stone and ice, the passage of time felt different. Each toll of the ancient bell in the keep resonated like a heartbeat, measuring grief as much as it did the hours. Every echo carried with it a duality, a proof of survival, and a reminder that memory could be heavier than armor. He paused at the edge of the courtyard, the wind tugging at his cloak, bending it against his frame. Fingers grazed the frozen surface of the battlements, and he felt the bite of winter in every nerve. Snowflakes, sharp as crystal daggers, landed on his hair, on the folds of his clothing, on the sword at his side. He wondered, as he often did in these long hours, what remained to fight for. Was it the banner that flapped listlessly in the wind, or the memory of those who had fallen beneath it? Was it vengeance, loyalty, or simply the stubborn insistence to endure? Inside, the hearth crackled, an uneven rhythm that mocked the stillness of the night. He returned to it, drawing his hands close for warmth, but the fire could not thaw the chill in his chest, the frost that had settled on the edges of his soul. He thought of the faces of the men he had buried in snow, their eyes frozen open in terror, mouths slightly agape, as if to speak final words that would never be heard. Those images had been etched into him, layered over and over until memory and present day became indistinguishable. He could feel them in the shift of shadows, in the sudden silence that fell when the wind stilled for even a heartbeat. Then a whisper caught in the gust, a faint sound beyond the walls, something that belonged neither to wind nor snow. He paused, straining. The courtyard was empty save for drifting powder and the rhythm of his own pulse. And yet, in that silence, he sensed life beyond this fortress, a reminder that the world persisted even while he remained bound by stone, ice, and remembrance. Slowly, deliberately, he tightened his grip on the sword. The cold was numbing, but his resolve burned hotter, a quiet defiance that flared against the oppression of solitude and loss. Each step across the icy stones was a claim, a statement that he would endure, that the weight of grief would not bend him into submission. The fortress, with all its shadows and echoes, was both prison and sanctuary. He moved through it as though carrying the lives of his fallen comrades in every breath, every cautious step, a living testament to their memory. The bell tolled again, deeper now, and the sound vibrated through the walls, through the frozen ground beneath his boots. He listened, letting it sink into his bones. It was both lamentation and affirmation. He had survived, and yet survival was only the beginning. Beyond these walls lay more trials, more storms, more nights in which silence would press against the stone and against his spirit. The snow whispered promises of a world still waiting, still watching, still testing. He paused once more at the battlements, staring into the endless white, a solitary figure etched against the pale landscape. His breath formed clouds that mingled with the wind, carrying the scent of frost, wood smoke, and distant life. He pressed a hand to the banner, feeling the rough texture of fabric stiff with ice. The lion's roar, hidden beneath frost and soot, seemed to pulse faintly beneath his fingers, a fragile echo of former glory. He let his eyes close briefly, listening to the wind, the fire, the bell, letting memory and present intertwine. When he opened them again, the world beyond the walls seemed more vivid, sharper in contrast to the isolation. He knew the path ahead would demand more than endurance. It would demand a heart willing to confront loss, betrayal, and the emptiness that follows victory and failure alike. Yet he would walk it, bound by oath, memory, and a defiance as stubborn as winter itself. And as the snow continued its quiet descent, covering the courtyard in white silence, he lifted his sword one last time, feeling its cold weight as a reminder that the future, like the past, belonged to those who dared to endure. The fortress walls shivered once more under the wind, and he stepped forward, a solitary figure against the endless white, ready to honor a fate that was his alone and the memories of those who had fallen to make him so. The city breathed like a wounded animal, its walls scorched and weeping soot. Smoke curled from fractured rooftops, tendrils that tasted of ash and despair. Through the narrow streets, the young archer moved as though she were part of the shadows themselves, her quiver light upon her back, but the weight of resolve pressing against her chest like a stone. Every footfall was a whisper, a conversation with the ghosts that lingered in the alleys, in the rubble, in the hollowed eyes of a city that had once thrummed with life. Cobblestones, slick with mud and streaked with the dark residue of blood, caught at the hem of her boots. She inhaled the scent of damp earth, of charred timber, of smoke clinging to the remnants of market stalls, and it was a perfume that spoke of impermanence. Each breath was a reminder that life was fragile, a candle fighting the wind, flickering in the corridors of history where nothing stayed untouched for long. Behind her, faint echoes rose, a moan of the wounded, a soft sob swallowed by the hollowness of ruined streets, and the deep toll of the bell from the cathedral, a resonance that had survived centuries of siege and sorrow. It vibrated through the stone, through her bones, as if the city itself mourned and yet refused to yield completely. Her bow, strung tight with sinew and oil, hung like a talisman across her shoulder. To her, it was more than wood and string. It was her lifeline, the witness to every shadowed step, every moment of courage etched into these streets. The bow knew her heartbeat, the small, rapid thrum that signaled both vigilance and determination. Fingers that had known the weight of parchment, of ink, of secret letters, now understood the weight of survival. And as she passed a collapsed wall, a shard of her own reflection caught in broken glass, reminding her that even here, amidst ruin, fragments of self could endure. In the market square, the aftermath of a life once ordinary lay in quiet disarray. Stalls, overturned and splintered, still bore remnants of bread, of onions, of salted fish, mundane sustenance now tinged with fear. She paused, touching the splintered wood, inhaling the scents that had once meant nourishment and commerce. Her mind flickered to the oaths she had sworn, the secret rites her guild had carved into memory, the songs her mother had whispered beside the hearth before fire and steel had transformed their world into ashen echoes. Each memory was a thread in a tapestry she wove as she walked, one of resilience stitched from grief, courage, and quiet defiance. Shadows clung to the alleys like loyal sentinels, moving with her, shifting as she shifted, folding her into the city's wounded embrace. Here, in these dim corridors, she understood the cruelty of life, its sudden, unannounced intrusions. She also understood its poetry, the way a candle flame could dance against stone and still make the darkness bearable. She moved with precision born of both necessity and reverence, as though each footfall were a letter and a message to the past, a story of survival to be inscribed for those yet to come. At the city gates, she lifted her eyes to the sky. Crows circled in lazy arcs, black ink blotting the gray of dawn, their cries sharp against the tolling bell. They were reminders, she thought, of impermanence, of the inevitability of loss. Yet, even as the wind tore at her cloak, even as the acrid scent of smoke stung her throat, her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from a quiet insistence that she would endure. Every step forward was a declaration, every measured breath a prayer that life, however fragile, could assert itself against the tide of ruin. The bow at her back became an extension of thought, an instrument that held her resolve taut. Her hands knew instinctively the weight of it, the balance between tension and release, mirroring the balance she sought within herself. The city was a canvas of grief, each scar a brushstroke of history, and she, in her smallness, was both witness and participant. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, scanned the ruined streets, taking in the lean of collapsed roofs, the shadows beneath fallen carts, the glint of metal where once there had been gates. In these fragments, she saw the stories of countless souls, each life a note in the somber symphony of endurance. Memories arrived in fragments, her mother's hand on hers as a child, guiding the arrow through the makeshift targets, her father's quiet nod of approval after a practice that left her bruised but unbroken, the first oath to her guild, whispered in the cold of an unlit chamber, promising fidelity, secrecy, and courage. These recollections wove through her like threads of gold through mud, reminders that she was not just surviving, but carrying forward the essence of all who had shaped her. Each step was not mere movement, but a continuation of a lineage, a living tribute to the past that refused to be silenced. The market square became a gallery of absence, every overturned basket, every scorched stall, a testament to what had been and what had been taken. She moved carefully among them, mindful of the echoes beneath her feet, of the stories trapped in the soil, in the air, in the stone walls scarred by cannon and arrow. Even in the midst of decay, she found the ordinary, the bread crusts, the remnants of salted fish, the rusted nails of abandoned carts, and in them, a whisper of life stubbornly clinging to existence. Survival, she realized, was not merely about avoiding death, but about tending to the small, tangible fragments of humanity that persisted despite violence and neglect. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it a scent she could not name, a reminder that she was never truly alone. Somewhere, hidden within the labyrinth of streets, other lives persisted, other hearts beat with fear and determination alike. She crouched briefly in the shadow of a collapsed archway, letting the wind brush against her cheek, listening to the cadence of distant cries, the uneven thrum of fleeing hooves, the soft scrape of a cart abandoned in haste. These sounds, fragmented and uneven, formed a rhythm that matched her own, a heartbeat within the city's own wounded pulse. Raising her eyes again to the horizon, she saw the black shapes of crows wheeling across the sky, the smoke rising like banners of defiance and lamentation. Her hands rested on her bow, fingers flexing as though readying an arrow that did not yet exist, the tension a reflection of the quiet insistence within her that she would not break. Each moment was a choice, to linger in despair or to move, to act, to survive. And in that choice, she found her legend forming, not in songs sung in the warmth of a home, but in the silent, defiant steps through mud, blood, and shadow. As she stepped toward the narrow gate that opened beyond the city walls, she felt the weight of the streets she had traversed settle into her bones. She carried the echoes of the fallen, the prayers of the living, the songs whispered in secret, and the indelible imprint of a city that refused to yield entirely. Her journey was far from over, but in that moment, she was both witness and testament, a pulse of life amidst ruins, a thread of continuity woven into the tapestry of history. With each breath, she stitched fragments of courage and memory into a pattern that would endure longer than walls, longer than fire, longer than fear. And so she moved onward, her figure a shadow among shadows, her heart a quiet drumbeat of persistence. The city behind her exhaled, the smoke curling skyward in silent farewell, and ahead the unknown waited. Yet, in the tightening of her grip upon her bow, in the steady rhythm of her pulse, she carried a singular certainty, that survival is not merely the act of living, but the act of bearing witness, of carrying forward the stories of those who came before, of ensuring that courage and memory endure where stone and blood have fallen. She was the city's heartbeat, the quiet song of perseverance echoing against ruin, and the promise that the tales of resilience would outlast the fire that had sought to silence them. The forest was dense and unyielding, a cathedral of pine and frost where silence fell like a heavy curtain, muffling even the whisper of the wind. Each branch hung low with the weight of ice, each needle a frozen shard of green that shivered under the fragile winter sun. A lone knight moved through this world of shadows, his horse's hooves barely stirring the carpet of moss and fallen leaves. Armor clinked softly with each careful step, a sound swallowed immediately by the vast emptiness, leaving only the faint echo of history in its wake. Scars marked his breastplate, dents and scratches that caught the pale light, glinting like bitter memories. Each mark carried a story, each story a testament to battles fought and lives shattered. He remembered the massacre, the fire, the screams that tore through the night like a knife, relentless and consuming. Raiders had come with steel and fury, and the village had burned in their wake. He had watched homes collapse, families swallowed by smoke and flame, and he had been powerless, a witness to terror. The faces of the lost haunted him, a mother clutching her child, eyes wide and unseeing, an old man standing defiantly before the flames, his staff like a final gesture of resistance. The children, their laughter now a memory drowned in ash. He carried their absence with him as a weight heavier than any armor, pressing against his chest, reminding him of survival's bitter edge. The forest seemed alive with memory, each tree a sentinel that had watched, silent and unyielding. Moss clung to bark like old wounds, and the air smelled of resin and wet leaves, mingling with the faint tang of iron from a nearby stream. The knight's gloved hands tightened on the reins. Every step forward through the underbrush became a meditation, a prayer whispered to ghosts and stones alike. The ground was uneven, littered with roots that clawed through soil like ancient fingers, and yet he pressed on, guided by a determination that had been forged in fire and sorrow. Birds flitted among the branches, their calls a strange chorus that balanced lament with affirmation. A raven landed briefly on a gnarled limb, black feathers gleaming, watching him with dark, unreadable eyes. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps judgment. He did not know, nor did he care. In his pack, a tattered journal pressed against his back, its pages frayed, ink faded with age and wear. It contained names, sketches, brief memories of those who had perished. Each entry was an act of devotion, a ritual of remembrance, a small defiance against the erasure of life. He would pause at times, touching a corner of a page, murmuring a name as if speaking aloud could restore the absent to the realm of the living. Frost clung stubbornly to the edges of his cloak, to the leather straps of his saddle. Each breath emerged in small clouds, curling in the pale morning air. The cold was relentless, gnawing at exposed skin, creeping beneath his armor. And yet, it was a companion as much as a tormentor, a mirror of endurance. To survive was not merely to endure, but to bear the weight of memory without breaking, to navigate a world that had been stripped of innocence, yet still offered fragile glimpses of beauty. A clearing opened before him, a sudden space where sunlight broke through the canopy in shards of gold and honey. The light fell upon the scarred earth, upon fallen branches blackened by frost, and for a moment the forest seemed to hold its breath. He dismounted, the leather of his boots soft against the mossy ground, and he allowed himself to look, really look, at what had been preserved amidst devastation. The sunlight struck the curve of a stream, icy water shimmering like molten silver. Each droplet caught the light and fractured it, scattering brilliance in every direction, as though the world itself had decided to remember beauty alongside loss. He thought of the village, of the echoes of laughter and song that had once filled these woods. He thought of courage, not in great battles, but in the small, quiet defiance of living, of staying alive to bear witness. Survival was no triumph. It was a testament to persistence, an act of sacred continuity. Each step forward carried with it the weight of those who had fallen behind. Yet each step also carried hope, the faintest glimmer, the fragile insistence of life. The frost underfoot seemed less biting in the sunlight, less cruel, as if the world acknowledged his passage, offering a muted blessing for endurance. He knelt at the edge of the stream, brushing his hand through the icy water. The chill bit sharply, sending a shiver through his arm, but also anchored him, tethered him to the present. He traced the flow, imagining the water carrying away sorrow, carrying stories downstream, where they could linger in the undercurrents of memory. Above, branches swayed in an indifferent wind, the leaves whispering secrets in a language older than the night himself. And he listened. In that golden light, he saw survival not as mere existence, but as a living memorial. Each scar on his armor, each tear in his cloak, each careful step through frost and shadow was an offering to memory. The names in his journal were not just letters on paper. They were companions, spirits walking beside him, lending strength when the world threatened collapse. The forest, once a place of silent judgment, now seemed to pulse with quiet understanding. He mounted again, horse and rider moving as one, entering the depths where shadows still clung and frost painted the world in silver and gray. With every stride, he carried forward not just himself, but the echoes of lives extinguished too soon. He imagined their laughter like wind in the pines, their courage in the pulse of his heartbeat. Even the silence seemed to carry them, a whisper threading through branches, stones, and sky. As the clearing faded behind him, replaced once more by narrow paths and towering trees, he felt the weight of the journey settle, a familiar companion. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and yet possibility. For in this quiet, frost-bound cathedral, in the interplay of light and shadow, he understood survival was not simply avoiding death. Survival was the sacred task of carrying forward the lives of those lost, the fragile essence of human endurance, and a memory of love and courage that no fire, no steel, could entirely extinguish. And as the shadows thickened, the first hint of evening wrapping the forest in deeper silence, he rode on. Each hoofbeat was a drum of remembrance, each breath a prayer for what had been, and for what might yet endure. The forest watched, patient and eternal, as one man moved through grief and frost, carrying a world of echoes with him, toward whatever dawn awaited beyond the trees. A candle guttered in the corner of the stone chamber, its flame trembling like a last heartbeat in the cold. Smoke curled upward in lazy spirals, clinging to the arched ceiling, carrying with it the scent of melted wax and the faint, iron-tinged memory of old blood. The light barely touched the walls, leaving shadows to cling stubbornly in the corners, where the echoes of a long life seemed to huddle and whisper. An old warrior sat hunched over a faded map, his shoulders curved like the arch of the cathedral he had once stormed and defended in the same lifetime. His hands, calloused and trembling, traced each scar etched into the parchment, each mark a story, a wound, a reminder of the cost of survival. Each line and stain on the map was a battlefield, a city razed to ashes, a river crossed under moonless skies while the enemy slept like a dark shadow at his heels. He felt the memories as if they were still present. The screams of men whose names had been swallowed by the dirt, the heavy cry of mothers whose children had vanished into the chaos, the way the wind carried the scent of burning timber, mingled with smoke and the metallic tang of fear. In the silence of the chamber, those voices returned not as ghosts, but as companions, urging him to remember, to honor, to bear witness. His sword rested against the wall, hilt blackened and worn, a quiet sentinel of decades. Once, it had sung a terrible song of steel and vengeance. Now it merely held presence, a memory of purpose, a reminder that time moves inexorably forward even as men wither and fall. He ran a finger along its edge, feeling the tiny chips, the ridges of battle survived, and felt a pang for those who had not. The iron seemed to hum faintly, not with anger, but with the weight of accumulated history, the sort of energy that lives where lives were lived fiercely and lost tragically. Outside, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer rang through the valley, a rhythmic certainty unchanged through the generations. Each strike was a pulse in the vast, aching heart of time, and he imagined the hammer sparks flying like tiny stars, illuminating the nights of ancestors who had bent and shaped the same iron for survival. He allowed himself a moment to imagine the hands that had held those tools, the sweat and grit, the whispered curses and prayers, the hope sewn into every forged blade. Time pulled at him like the relentless tide against a cliff, reshaping the contours of his memory, smoothing the jagged edges, yet leaving the scars of experience etched deep. The walls of the chamber were draped in tapestries, frayed at the edges, faded with years, yet vibrant with the stories they bore. The figures woven into the threads were not merely myth, but lived truths. Warriors kneeling before fallen comrades, kings and queens whose reigns had ended in fire, hunts through darkened forests under a pale moon, and harvests fought for with the sweat of hands blistered and broken. Each tapestry was a mirror, reflecting not a legend invented, but a life endured. He studied them in silence, noting the details that spoke to him, the tension in a warrior's stance, the despair in a mother's eyes, the triumph of survival even when victory seemed impossible. He whispered prayers into the dim air, words that caught on the smoke and danced upward toward the vaulted ceiling. Prayers for the nameless, the forgotten, the children orphaned by war, for women who bore hope as their shield, carrying it quietly through the rubble and ruin. He prayed for the men who had fallen beside him, for the laughter that would never return, for the blood soaked into the earth that would never be remembered. His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of memory, from the recognition that to survive is to carry an unending burden, a ledger of grief, loss, and quiet endurance. The dawn crept toward the chamber, pale and trembling, brushing frost against the window panes. The morning light caught the ice, scattering it into 1,000 tiny prisms, each reflecting a fragile persistence, a glimmer of life that refused to yield. He traced the shimmer with eyes grown dim, yet fierce with remembrance, seeing in it the truth that life, like the frost, persists in fragile, fleeting moments. Even as cities burn and empires crumble, even as men and women vanish into memory, something endures, the stubborn heartbeat of existence, the defiance of being against the inevitability of decay. He thought of the paths he had walked, of the rivers crossed in silence, the villages that had vanished under smoke, and the nights spent in endless darkness, listening to the whispers of the wind through shattered roofs. Each memory pressed against his chest with the weight of iron. Yet there was grace in it too, a recognition that to endure, to witness, to remember, is itself a form of immortality. The chamber smelled faintly of wax, of iron, of time, of the delicate decay of parchment, and he let those scents carry him across decades, through moments of terror and fleeting triumph. In the hush of early morning, he heard it again, the soft, distant hammering, and it seemed to him that the world had not changed at all. The sounds of toil and creation continued, as they always had, as they always would. Life, he realized, bends and breaks, yes, but it also carries on, persistent and silent, like the frost on the window, like the candle smoke climbing the arched ceiling, like the stories etched into the very bones of the land. He touched the map one last time, pressing his hand over a scarred riverbank, a city leveled, a battlefield frozen in memory, and he felt both sorrow and a strange, quiet pride. For in survival there is a story, and in remembrance there is legend. Each life endured is a thread in a vast tapestry, stretching beyond the walls of this stone chamber, beyond the fleeting warmth of candlelight, beyond the reach of memory itself. Outside, the frost began to melt in the morning sun, water dripping slowly into the frozen earth, promising renewal in its silent, patient way. And in that moment, the old warrior knew that while names may fade and walls may crumble, the marrow of legend resides in those who endure. The candle flickered once more before settling into a steady glow, a small witness to the persistence of life, a signal that the journey continues, and that the tales yet to be told will carry forward the echoes of all who have come before. And as he rose from his seat, leaning on the sword that had borne witness to a lifetime of storms, he allowed himself a single thought, that survival is not merely to exist, but to carry forward the memory of those who could not, and in doing so, to write a story that will never truly die. The frost glimmered one last time through the window, fragile and eternal, a quiet herald for what comes next. On the banks of a slow, silver river, the warrior knelt. Her hands dipped into the cold, biting water, and a shiver ran up her arms, weaving with the ache that still throbbed in her bones. The river whispered against stones slick with moss, carrying secrets she could almost understand if she listened closely enough. Her cloak, patched and frayed, brushed the reeds with a rustle like whispered prayers, a soft hymn for the lost. Smoke from a distant hearth mingled with the damp scent of earth, and the forest leaned in, watching in patient silence, its moss-draped limbs heavy with shadow. She had survived. The word was both a victory and a curse. The memory of the fire still lingered, tongues of flame licking at the walls of a village she had once called home, consuming all that she had loved. The air had been thick with smoke and screams, the cries of comrades who had become nothing more than ash in her mouth. Arrows had pierced shields, spears had torn through ranks, and betrayal had tasted sharper than any steel. She remembered the treacherous glint in her allies' eyes before they struck. In that moment, survival had been no more than a raw, desperate clawing at life, a frantic measure of breath and muscle. And now, here, the river's silver edge reflected a sky she could not escape. Its shards of blue and gray mirrored the fractures in her own memory. She traced her fingers along the water, letting the currents stir and twist, As if by touch she could reach back into the past, gathering fragments of those she had lost. Their laughter, brittle as dried reeds, flickered in her mind. Their laments, slow and mournful, hovered in the air like smoke that refused to dissipate. She inhaled deeply, as though each breath could carry them home, though she knew there was no home to carry them to. The wind brought whispers, the brush of wings from a startled bird, the distant toll of a village bell, half hidden by fog, calling to lives she could no longer touch. She let the sounds settle in her chest, heavy and familiar, a rhythm to anchor her in the world that had endured despite everything. The mud beneath her knees sucked at her cloak, cold and persistent, reminding her that every step, every choice, carried weight. Stones slick with river growth pressed against her palms, grounding her in the present. She touched each branch, each reed, as if the forest itself were a witness to her claim on life. There was defiance in the smallest gestures, lifting a stone, brushing mud from her face, proof that the world had not yet crushed her entirely. And in the quiet, her thoughts turned inward, circling the names of those who had fallen, brothers, sisters, friends, all gone in fire and steel. She let their faces float before her eyes, translucent in the water's edge, and she murmured words they could no longer hear, prayers as fragile as morning fog. Time passed differently by the river. Minutes stretched into hours, and the sun hung low, a fragile gold that pierced through the mist. Shadows deepened among the mossy trunks, and every sound was amplified. A rustle of leaves, a bird startled into flight, the faint sigh of water over stone. She rose, muscles stiff but alive, the chill of the river retreating from her skin. Her cloak hung heavy, damp and worn, yet she moved with the deliberate grace of someone who has survived the impossible. Each step along the muddy bank was an assertion, a quiet claim to the world she refused to abandon. She had been forged in fire and betrayal, tempered in grief, and now she walked as one who had seen death and returned. As she moved, the river seemed to speak to her. Its silvered surface shifted with every ripple, catching fragments of sky, clouds, and light. In those fleeting reflections, she glimpsed both what was and what might be, a possibility of return, a promise of endurance, and the unyielding impossibility of forgetting. She understood that memory was a companion as constant and heavy as the water itself. It could weigh her down, drag her under, or it could buoy her, carrying her forward on a current unseen. Her fingers lingered on the river's surface, tracing shapes that disappeared before her eyes, much like the faces she carried within her heart. And yet, the act itself, the gesture of touching, of acknowledging, was a form of survival in itself. She paused on a small rise by the bank, watching the fog twist and curl through the trees. The village bell tolled again, deeper now, echoing through the valley, carrying with it the weight of lives untouched, of stories yet to unfold. She imagined the faces of strangers, villagers who would never know the fire, who walked safely under the sun, unmarked by betrayal. And she wondered, silently, if her presence would ever be more than a shadow in their stories, if the river would ever carry her name as freely as it carried their own. But even in the solitude, she felt the pulse of connection, the echo of all lives entwined, the delicate thread that bound the living to the lost. Night began to fall in gentle increments, folding the forest into deeper shades of gray and silver. The wind rose, teasing her hair and cloak, stirring the reeds like fingers brushing over parchment. Somewhere a fox cried, a sharp, mournful sound that cut through the silence. She drew a steadying breath, letting the air fill her lungs with the cool scent of water and earth. And in that breath, she felt the accumulation of all she had endured, the fire, the arrows, the betrayals, and the grief. She had been broken, and yet she had endured. She was more than memory. She was presence, a living testament to defiance and hope. Finally, she moved to the edge where the river widened, where its silver surface gleamed like molten metal under the dying light. She knelt briefly, letting her reflection meet her gaze. There was no triumph in it, only acknowledgement, a quiet recognition of pain survived, of ghosts carried, of life claimed anew. The fog clung to her like a shroud, and yet the gold of sunlight breaking through promised something beyond mourning, something beyond exile. She rose again, unbowed, a figure poised between the living and the remembered, between what had been lost and what remained to fight for. Her shadow stretched long and thin across the water, merging with the reflections of sky and tree, an emblem of endurance caught between two worlds. And as she walked along the riverbank, the forest exhaled around her, leaves whispering in the evening breeze. She carried her companions in silence, a sacred procession of memory and honor that neither fire nor betrayal could extinguish. Her steps, careful and deliberate, pressed life into the mud. Her fingers brushed the stones, and her eyes traced the horizon where the fog met sky. In that place, in that fragile convergence of past and present, she understood the truth of survival. It is not merely to endure, but to bear witness, to move forward with reverence for all that was lost, and with the courage to face whatever waits beyond the river's bend. She disappeared into the mist, the water whispering behind her, a silver thread of memory stretching into the unknown.